So I've been working on a revision video for my character guide, and about a third of the comments on that video are about Alcryst, so I thought he deserved his own video. In that guide, I put Alcryst in the filler/OK return on investment category, and what I meant by that is basically that Alcryst is great when he joins, but I think there are better options later on. So I'm going to explain why I think that is, and this video is going to assume that we're playing on Maddening at a fairly casual pace since that character guide video was designed for newer players. A quick preface, this is not an anti-Alcryst video. He's super fun to use, and if you like him, you should use him. I just think there are better options if you want to make the game as easy on yourself as possible, and I wanted to address what I see as a couple misconceptions from the comment section on the previous video. So let's start with what Alcryst does well. He joins us in Chapter 7 as a level 10 archer with a steel bow, and that alone is pretty good. His bases are high enough to one-shot flyers, and if you want to use him longer term, he's ready for promotion right off the bat. This is the main reason I prefer him over Etier, who needs 6 levels before she can promote. On Maddening, that's a lot of experience for Etier to need. Alcryst is probably going to be your main flyer killer for at least a few chapters, and he provides good chip damage against non-flyers. But stiffer competition appears in Chapter 12 and 13, and this is around where I usually drop him. The stiffer competition comes in the form of 3 units: Fogado, who joins in Chapter 12, and Fogado and Merrin, who join in Chapter 13. Those second 2 can't use bows naturally, but a warrior reclass is a great fit for both of them. And I'm going to be primarily comparing Alcryst to Merrin and Fogado because being worse than Fogado doesn't mean much. She's a top 2 combat unit in the game, and she also often wants to be enemy phasing with Vantage instead of being on flyer duty, so Merrin and Fogado are some common competition for Alcryst throughout most of the game. An archer's main job is killing flyers, so let's start by seeing how these units do against flyers throughout the game. We'll start with Chapter 14, as that's when all the units are available and can be in their bow classes, and also when promoted flyers that can be difficult to one-shot start to appear more often. On this map, we have Wyvern Knights and unpromoted flyers. The unpromoted flyers are no problem. It takes 0 strength to kill them with a +1 silver bow, and Alcryst has more than 0 strength, so no issue here. The Wyverns are a little tougher, with 47 health and 20 defense. Let's look at Alcryst's performance with either the killer bow or the silver bow. Note that I am assuming Alcryst's personal skill is active in all of these spreadsheets. It's not always active, but it's so trivial to trigger that I think he has the extra 3 strength more often than not. With the +1 silver bow, Alcryst is 3 points of damage short of one-shotting the Wyvern. It's pretty trivial to make up for that 3 damage though. Attacking while next to a Leer, or getting an assist from a chain attack, or even a meal and a bond ring, or any plus might engrave, gets Alcryst to where he needs to be to score this one-shot with the silver bow. With that in mind, there's no reason to chance it with the killer bow, so Alcryst does very well against the flyers here. Fogado in Warrior has basically the same performance, except he's only 2 damage short of killing the Wyvern with the silver bow, so just a tonic will do for hitting that threshold, so a very slight improvement, but not by much. Similarly, Merrin does just a little better than even that, needing just 1 extra point of damage to kill the Wyvern in one shot, so easy enough to just get that from a meal. A little later in the game, flyers get tougher and we start to see lots of Wyverns and Griffin Knights instead of unpromoted flyers, and Chapter 18 has a lot of them, so let's take a look at how our units stack up against each other in Chapter 18. Against the Griffin Knights, Alcryst does great, one-shotting them with a +1 silver bow easily. However, he doesn't fare as well with the Wyvern Knights, coming up 13 damage short of one-shotting them and 7 speed too slow to double with the silver bow. Fortunately, we have the Radiant Bow, which Alcryst can use to kill the Wyverns with a +4 Forge, which is surprisingly cheap. The Griffins have a little bit more resistance, so Alcryst needs a Radiant Bow +5 to one-shot those. So he does fine on this map as long as you forge him a Radiant Bow. Fogado and Merrin here perform similarly against the flyers, but their magic is a little higher, so they just need a +4 Radiant Bow to one-shot either. And this is basically how flyer killing looks until late game, with a forged Radiant Bow taking out flyers. Occasionally, Alcryst needs a small amount of help to do this through a tonic, meal, or ring, while others don't, but nobody needs a lot of investment to one-shot the flyers through the mid-game. We only see a significant difference versus flyers in the last 5 chapters of the game when enemies have another difficulty hike. In Chapter 24, it's pretty difficult to kill the Wyverns using physical damage as they sport 71 HP and 35 defense, so all of our archer candidates will be turning to the Radiant Bow for flyer killing duties. With the Radiant Bow, Alcryst comes up short of killing both the Griffin and Wyvern Knights in this chapter. He misses the Griffin one-shot by 14 damage and the Wyvern one-shot by 16 damage. Both of these enemies are faster than Alcryst, so he'll need significant speed help to double either of them. and without doubling, Luna only has a 37% chance to get us to the one-shot threshold. We can pump up the bow's might a little higher by giving it an Icongrave, but this still leaves us 7 points of damage short of one-shotting the flyer. We can overcome this with something like a high bond Celica for +5 magic and a tonic, or a couple chain attacks. So Alcryst struggles with these flyers, and getting him to one-shot them is possible, but it will come at the cost of resources that you could have used to fix his speed or boost his dex for higher Luna chances. Fogado and Warrior with a +5 Radiant Bow comes up 7 damage short of one-shotting the Griffin and 9 damage short of one-shotting the Wyvern, so an Icongrave gets us to one-shotting both of them with no other help. Warrior Merrin's magic is 3 higher than Warrior Fogado's, so she also just needs an Icongrave on the Radiant Bow, although she could also get the one-shots with the Celica emblem and any other magic boost, so if you want to use the Icongrave on another weapon, or if you want to double non-flyers with the Radiant Bow, Merrin has the best chance of one-shotting these Wyverns without the Icongrave. The Icongrave is one of the less in-demand engraves, so engraving the Radiant Bow isn't usually too big of a deal, unless you're using a Dire Thunder build and want the Icongrave for that. So basically, everybody can hit the flyer one-shot breakpoints for the early and mid-game, but Alcryst will need a little help from tonics or bond rings in the mid-game, and in the late game, Alcryst can't quite one-shot the flyers anymore as his low magic holds him back, and physical bows have lower might and higher defenses to punch through. Alcryst has to rely on a crit with the Killer Bow, a Luna with the Radiant Bow, or have a lot of speed or magic help to one-shot the late-game flyers. So Alcryst doesn't do as well against flyers as the other archers, but Luna should be of more value against non-flyers that Alcryst's competition isn't one-shotting, especially slower high-defense enemies that he has an easier time doubling, and that could make up for needing some help to one-shot flyers for the last few maps of the game. So let's look at non-flyers. In Chapter 14, Alcryst does great against slower, unpromoted enemies that he can double. So against the lance fighters on this map, he easily one-rounds with a silver bow. The promoted enemies are tougher though. The halberdiers on this map are fast enough that Alcryst needs 6 speed to double them, which he could get through Lyn or Lucina and a speed meal, but these are competitive emblems, and without them Alcryst is dealing just 10 damage on a hit, 30 on a crit, and 19 on a Luna. The halberdier has 44 HP, so we're just providing a little chip here with a 36% chance of critting for greater chip and an 11% chance at Luna critting and killing the halberdier. Fogado and Merrin are performing similarly to Alcryst here. There's no Radiant Bow in play until partway through the chapter, so Merrin and Fogado are just slightly closer to doubling the halberdier and dealing 1 or 2 more points of damage. In this chapter, the damage performances of all of our archers are fairly similar, both for flyers and grounded units, so the main differences between Alcryst and the other options are a little more damage and chain attacks from the warriors, versus Alcryst's chance of Lunaing for extra damage, and the very slim chance of Luna critting for the occasional kill. I prefer the reliability of the chain attacks here, but it's fairly close and Alcryst does fine in this chapter. And if you want to invest a Lyn or a Lucina ring, Alcryst's performance is better here as he'll have another chance to proc Luna. But I think we have better uses for those rings than putting them on any of our archers, as units like Ivy can use those rings to one round without having to rely on a crit or a Luna proc at all. In Chapter 18, the Radiant Bow becomes available, and everyone has had a little bit more time to grow, so let's look at performances there. With his low magic, Alcryst will usually be doing more damage with the Silver Bow and only slightly less with the Killer Bow compared to the Radiant Bow, so except against very low resistance enemies, it's probably better to stick with physical bows on Alcryst for non-flyers. Against the Berserkers in Chapter 18, Alcryst is 4 speed short of doubling, which is fixable but not negligible, and you'll want him to double too as he's dealing only 15 to 19 damage per hit out of the 64 health of the Berserker, so a single crit won't get him to a kill. A Luna crit can kill, but the chance is only 14%. If doubling, Alcryst has about a 70% chance of scoring at least 1 critical and killing the Berserker on the second attack. And you do need a crit here, a double Luna with no crit doesn't quite get us there. We can also look at the General on this map, where Luna should be a big deal since it cuts defense in half and Generals have very high defense. Plus, Alcryst doesn't have an issue doubling Generals. With a +4 Radiant Bow, Alcryst can double the Generals for 17 damage each shot, with a 51% chance of Lunaing at least once for 39 damage. He doesn't quite kill without a second Luna though, which only happens 9% of the time. The Killer Bow at +4 deals 0 damage to the General, and even a Luna crit will only deal 40 with a 13% chance of occurring, and this still leaves the General alive, so you're probably better off going with the Radiant Bow here. Fogado and Merrin deal similar damage to the Berserker here with the Killer Bow, doing 2 to 4 more points of damage per hit, and having a couple more points of speed in exchange for the loss of Luna. The speed is most relevant here, as Merrin and Fogado in Warrior only need 2 speed to double, which they can get from a meal or a tonic. Alcryst will need to use another resource, like a skill or a ring, so Merrin and Fogado can either use less resources or use those extra resources on extra strength or magic instead of on speed. Against the General, Warrior Fogado does 6 more damage per hit with the Radiant Bow compared to Alcryst, and Merrin does 7 more. They all double, so it will be a 12 to 14 point damage difference for the trade-off of not having Luna. Alcryst needs to activate Luna at least once to deal more damage than Merrin or Fogado, which happens 51% of the time. We can see the different Luna probabilities in this table. 49% of the time, Alcryst will get no Luna and perform worse than Merrin and Fogado, dealing 34 damage compared to Merrin's 46. While 42% of the time he'll get 1 Luna and perform better, dealing 56 damage compared to Merrin's 46, and 9% of the time he will get a double Luna and kill the General. So Alcryst is doing better than his competition 51% of the time, and assuming we don't care about the reliability of the damage, Alcryst is doing a little bit better than the competition here. The math is similar for the Berserker, except Alcryst isn't doubling the Berserker without speed help. Overall, in this chapter, I think Merrin and Fogado's speed leads are more relevant than the edge Alcryst has against very slow enemies 51% of the time. You'll still want to turn to your mages for reliable armor killing on this map. The performances are pretty close though, and I could see choosing Alcryst for the chance to high roll double Lunas or Luna crits, since the average performance between our choices isn't that different. In the late game, Luna is at its best since Alcryst's dex has grown, and you probably have a +5 forge on your killer bow, which increases our chance of a Luna crit. In Chapter 24, Alcryst deals 11 damage to warriors with a +5 killer bow, with a 53% chance to crit. The warrior has 78 health though, so we're basically tickling him without a crit, and even on a crit we're only dealing 33. A Luna crit does 73, so that plus doubling can kill the warrior. Alcryst is 3 speed short of doubling, so he needs just a small amount of help to get there. So after doubling help, there is a 36% chance of getting a Luna crit, so on average, Alcryst isn't doing that well against the Berserker here. Against the generals in Chapter 24, Alcryst just shouldn't use the killer bow. He does 0 damage on a hit or a crit, and only 37 on a Luna crit. So he can just take out the general's 74 health with a double Luna crit, but that only happens 3% of the time. On a Radiant Bow, Alcryst deals 13 damage to the General and 39 on a Luna. There's no crit on this bow, so you're not likely to get a Luna crit, but there is one problem with using the Radiant Bow on this map, which is that for Alcryst to one-shot the flyers, he needs to have an Ike engrave on the Radiant Bow, and this is going to prevent him from doubling. So Alcryst's performance against the Generals is pretty bad if you don't give him the engrave, but without the engrave he won't one-shot the flyers. Fogado's performance against the Berserker on this map is similar. He deals 3 more points of damage and doubles without speed help. Merrin deals 5 more damage without speed help, so in total that's 6 to 10 points of extra damage, more if you crit. But the important thing here is that Merrin and Fogado do not need speed help to double the warrior, while Alcryst needs 3 speed. So Merrin and Fogado can instead invest in strength or magic, increasing their damage lead to the point where Alcryst needs 2 Lunas to do more damage than them. And remember that damage is tripled on crits, so higher base damage makes for bigger crits. Merrin and Fogado can kill the warrior on a double crit, Alcryst needs a Luna crit. The Luna crit is only 12% more likely than the double crit, so Alcryst isn't that much more likely to one-round the warrior, even accounting for Luna crits. So let's look at a probability table here. Assuming that we give Alcryst 3 points of speed and his competition 3 points of strength, Alcryst will do slightly less damage than his peers with just 1 Luna, which happens 48% of the time. 14% of the time he'll get a double Luna and do better than Merrin and Fogado, and 38% of the time he will get no Lunas and do significantly worse damage than his competition. Against the General, Fogado has the same issue as Alcryst, where he needs the Radiant Bow to have the Ike engrave, so both are going to either do low chip damage with a single Radiant Bow attack, or 0 on a Killer or Silver Bow attack. Alcryst does have the opportunity to Luna crit here, 2 of which can kill the General, but it's only an 18% chance to Luna crit once and a 3% chance to do it twice. Basically, these two should just be leaving the Generals alone and your mages can handle them. While it's very exciting when Alcryst kills someone after a 0 damage forecast, there's almost always better things for Alcryst to be doing than chancing a 3% chance to kill a General. Merrin has high enough magic that it's feasible for her to one-shot the late-game flyers with a magic ring instead of an Ike engrave, so if you do that, she'll have the option of using the Radiant Bow against the Generals and doubling. That would amount to 44 damage to the General, plus more for however much magic help you gave her. And that's not bad, but the General has 73 HP. So again, you should probably just leave the Generals to your mages. Overall, Alcryst combat against non-flyers was better than I expected, but his speed really holds him back. I only compared using enemies that Alcryst can feasibly double, but faster enemies like paladins and heroes are very difficult for Alcryst to double. He's 10 speed too slow to double chapter 24 heroes, for example, and Fogado and Merrin are both faster, allowing them to either spend more resources on extra damage instead of doubling, or you can invest speed in all of them and Merrin and Fogado will still double more things than Alcryst does. The issue with speed resources is that they're competitive. Alcryst really wants the Lin Ring, but he's fighting with units like Panette, Ivy, and Amber to get it, and all of them can one-round enemies without relying on a proc chance. Alcryst has a similar issue with crit resources. He'd really like a Korin Engrave to add 30 to his crit, but we could be using that engrave on Kagetsu or any of the other units listed above to get them to one-rounding reliably instead of having to rely on Luna crits. Let's take a look at chapter 24 Alcryst with the Korin Engrave on a +5 killer bow. Against the warrior in this chapter, he needs a Luna crit. A double crit won't do enough damage. Even with the increased crit chance, he only gets one 54% of the time. Against the general, the lowered might from the Korin Engrave actually means 2 Luna crits isn't enough to kill anymore, though even if it were, it would only occur 9% of the time. We could give the same engrave to Merrin, and her higher strength lets her kill the warrior on a double crit, which happens 62% of the time. So while Alcryst can do well with resources like higher crit or higher speed, he's not doing better than his competition with them, and the resources he wants are all highly competitive. Notably, I've only really talked about bows so far because those are the only weapons Alcryst can use in his personal class, but they aren't the only weapons his competition can use. Merrin and Fogado can both use axes, so when appropriate, they can whip out a silver great axe to one-shot some enemies on enemy phase, or use a pole axe to deal with fast wolf knights that nobody is doubling. Being able to enemy phase is a nice boon that Alcryst doesn't really have. He is a covert type, so you can do some dodge tanking shenanigans with him on terrain, but it's better that his competition have the ability to enemy phase when you want them to. Plus, Merrin and Fogado in Warrior can also chain attack, so if you don't want to enemy phase with them, they'll still be contributing extra damage most turns through bow or longbow chain attacks. The main benefit from Alcryst's covert typing is access to 20 range Astrostorm on the Lin Ring. 20 range Astrostorm lets you aggro bosses from far away so that they'll rush your army, and this lets you finish some otherwise lengthy maps in a pretty short period of time. The thing is that you don't need a trained Alcryst to do this. If you want to use Astrostorm just to skip a map, you can take any covert unit, slap Lin on them, park them next to a Leer, and they can pull the boss for you. So the only time you need Alcryst for this is if he's important to the boss kill. Which maybe sometimes he is, but often you'll be able to boss kill with just Kagetsu and Panette. You won't actually need the Astrostormer to participate in the boss kill. That said, it is a nice bonus that sometimes he'll proc Luna a bunch on the Astrostorm and take out a chunk of the boss's health bar. And there are also a couple maps where 20 range Astrostorm with Luna can be nice. In Leaf's Paralog, you can use it to kill the enemy carrying the Speedwing, which lets you take the first portion of the map with the ballistas slowly, for example. But you shouldn't really be expecting Alcryst to kill tougher enemies with an Astrostorm unless you're buffing his strength or rigging Luna procs, as he often needs 3 or more to one-shot a tougher enemy. Warrior also has some utility with Astrostorm. Since they do more damage to broken enemies, you could do something like fracture an enemy and then use Astrostorm to kill the enemy. But this still only works within 10 range, so I would say the 20 range version is better, but this is some utility you get from having Lin on a warrior. Overall, I prefer the backup utility over the covert utility, but there are a few maps where the covert utility really comes in handy. At the end of the day, Alcryst is not bad. He's not doing that much worse than his competition, but he is doing a little worse. He needs a little bit of help to one-shot flyers in the mid-game, and he misses one-shots in the late game without a lot of help. And Luna isn't as reliable for killing enemies or increasing damage as one might think. The problem is that his competition just does those things a little better. They kill flyers the entire game with less resources, they double more things without help, they have access to more enemy types, and they can enemy phase. So that's why I put him in the filler category on my character guide. You should always use Alcryst in the early game, but there's not a ton of reason to use him after Fogado and Merrin show up, unless you just want to see the big Luna crits. And honestly, I do recommend doing that at least once because the big Luna crits are very fun. Thanks for watching the video. We're only a week away from the Sacred Stones PvP for LGBTQ youth stream on April 22nd, and we've got some great guests lined up and some fun donation incentives. So hopefully I'll see you there. There's a link to the stream in the video description, so you can set up a notification for when we go live if you want. And if you liked this video and you want to see more videos like it, consider hitting the like and subscribe button so that you never miss an upload. Thanks and have an awesome week.